Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture on sculpture in an expanded field, primarily dealing with earthworks or land art, which is a kind of catch-all label for a movement in sculpture that moves basically sculpture out of the confines of a gallery or with its intended situation being viewing in a museum or in someone's home to sculptures that were to be found oftentimes in the middle of nowhere, whose model of kind of thinking about why they would do these things was based upon ideas of expanding your way of thinking about why you're here on Earth, expanding, the way that you think about everything, including your own experience in the world. And so I just thought it would be a kind of fun way to wrap up this quarter to look at this movement that started in the late 60s, early 70s, and is still something you can enjoy. I mean, when I was in school as an undergraduate and I decided to be an art historian, I went out on a road trip to see a number of these things, and I've been back kind of every 2 or 3 years since then, and it's never really gotten old. They're a little bit like, and I'll talk about this a bit more. I mean, road trips are great anyway, right? But they're a little bit like a pilgrimage, or if you've seen any movies or heard people talk about, pilgrimages and what they're all about. This is similar to that without the affiliations to Christianity or any religion per se. But they are meant, like a pilgrimage, to take you out of your usual habitual ways of experiencing the world, set you out in the direction of some new experience, and along the way, because it's not just about viewing these sculptures, it's about the whole situation that leads you to these, unsettling your habitual ways of being in the world, as a philosopher might call it. So, let's have some fun with this, right? A good starting point for one of the things that definitely influenced the development of earthworks or land art is the movement known as minimalism, which we talked about in our last lecture. This is, of course, Robert Morris's Untitled L-beams. And what I want to remind you of here, one component of why this was important at the time, was that it was understood as a kind of radical critique of Greenbergian ideas of formalism, in that what this artist has done, like Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns did in terms of painting, is to reduce sculpture to its essence, or to its kind of basic building blocks, a la Greenberg's idea of modernism. But in so doing, what it actually does is it takes the Greenbergian idea that was always at the heart of kind of high modernist abstraction and formalist criticism, that everything that matters in the work of art is in the work of art itself, and it should work that way with this, because he's reduced this art form down to its essence. It takes that idea and it basically explodes it. It flips it over into, frankly, its opposite. Because what something that is so simplified like this does is it draws your attention to everything that is outside of the object that's influencing the way that you understand or experience that object. That Greenberg's idea that what you're supposed to do as a viewer is step up to the painting and kind of absent yourself, right? Get rid of your own subjective interpretation of what's going on and just be this disembodied I who is influenced by the formal arrangement that's going to provide you with this aesthetic experience. First of all, that's not really something that can be done, right? It's not something that any of us could ever do. And the question arose for a lot of these artists of the time, why would you want to do it anyway? Why would you want to get outside or take your own experience and say, I'm going to leave it at the door. I'm just going to let this work of art influence me. What instead they wanted to draw attention to, and I find this to be provocative from this time forward, not in terms necessarily of art, but in terms of everything, is they wanted you to be situated in relation to these works so that you would reflect upon your own experience. Yes, your experience is going to influence the way, and by this I mean your past experience is going to influence the way you experience something in the present. The way that you have been taught your broadly speaking, prejudices, the things that you've learned that form your prejudgments about the world, are always going to influence your current experience of things. But what these artists wanted to do is say, don't leave those previous experiences or prejudices at the door. What we want you to do is reflect upon how they are framing your current experience. Because if you know what is going into the way that you're making sense of the world, you can be maybe critical of it. You can have some control over it. You can think about all of the different ways that, again, we conceptualize the world and how that can be expanded if we can reflect back on what these major kind of critical way, I should put it another way, major concepts are by which we understand the world. And again, we've used a couple throughout this quarter, but I want to remind us of this, right? What I'm talking about here in an easy way to put it are things like, the way you think about gender and how much the way you think about gender influences the way you see other people, the way you think about ethnicity and how that influences the way you see other people. The way in this class, art is thought of as this is what art is, and then you look at particular objects in a particular way. But it's much more expansive than that, and these artists knew that. This is something that cultural critics and philosophers have been talking about for a very long time, which is we don't experience the world as naive viewers. We're not necessarily, understanding the world in any way objectively. Instead, the way that we understand the world has been deeply influenced by all the structures we have inherited, and by that I mean conceptual structures, from past ages, our parents, our peers, what we see in the news media, what we see, in terms of various representations around us. So art forms in the middle of the 60s that rise with the rise of postmodernist thought that's always been about kind of dismantling some of these habitual ways you understand the world, or at least making you reflect upon them, try to do that same thing through the art. And here with the Untitled L-beams, remember what Robert Morris is saying is, on the one hand, you could say it's just an L-beam, and you'd let your mind say, I know what that is. I'm just going to say and turn this into a concept, L-beam, and forget it, which is the way that knowledge works, right? The way prejudices work. We just have a predetermined idea. We see something out there that looks like that or is experienced like that, and we project onto it, and then we just leave it at that. But he also wanted you to get to what he called the experienced variable, right? Not just the known constant, the experienced variable, where, depending on your perspective, these things will look quite different, right? So think of that. Perspective being, in this case, really physical. You look at it from this height or from this angle, they look differently. But perspective is also, frankly, analogic. It's meant to be a metaphor for the idea of a perspective onto the world, a way of thinking about the world. There's no one correct perspective on the world. There are a whole host of different perspectives, and how do we make sense of that? But then beyond that, within the realm of art, of course, what sculptors looked at also was the question of how the environment in which you see a sculpture influences the way you experience that sculpture. So a small room is going to influence it, particular lighting influence it, the fact that you're going to an art gallery, which is a very particular kind of mode of viewing, is going to influence it. And so the entire situation in which one would experience a work of art suddenly becomes thought of as part of the work of art, right? And you, the viewers, coming to this and thinking about these things in particular ways, are the target for artists wanting to make you reflect upon that experience. And so it doesn't surprise, I suppose, to know that a lot of artists then said, why do you stick around the gallery? Maybe if we moved you out into the world, beyond that kind of, again, discourse of art, into the wider kind of realm of experience in general, that would be a way to, again, reflect upon all the habitual ways that you understand the world and your being in the world, the way that you think about what your life's all about, what your aspirations are, why you are or aren't important, what your affiliations are, and so forth. And here again, I want to return to, I suppose it's a metaphor, but maybe it's more than that, of the pilgrimage. Now, there are a million movies that have cropped up over the years about pilgrimages and what they mean. And of course, I suppose many of you have heard about the medieval pilgrimages and then the pilgrimages that still take place upon those same old pathways, in particular out to Santiago de Compostela in the kind of western part of Spain. Again, today you can still go on most of those trails that work their way from Italy and France and Germany all the way out to this spot in Spain. Why are people doing that? And when you watch these movies or read the books about them, it's about leading you through a journey that is meant to unsettle you, to make you think about things anew. Now, the destination is important, just as these works of art are important, but it is the journey itself that is really essential. And in that journey, you know, all the things that happen along the way are also going to be components that might influence your way of thinking about, like, why are you here? What's important to you? What matters? What doesn't matter? And so forth. So that's a part of these works, partially because they're out in the middle of nowhere. And when they were first conceived, this was way before GPS or anyone could pull out their phone and kind of mark out a spot to find these. You really had to search for them. You might get, as I did as a young student, my professor actually wrote out on a piece of paper, probably on the back of some assignment, these, pretty shoddy directions to Spiral Jetty, which you'll see in a moment here. And, there are things like head towards Salt Lake, and then you take a right on this road, and you probably go 8 to 12 miles, and then you take a left at the Rusty Gate and, go over the railroad tracks and by the dilapidated house, take a little gravel road over here, and then turn left at the Cactus. It was just preposterous, right? But the entire journey to find this and the uncertainty of finding it was a part of the experience of this work of art. But before we get there, let's talk about this artist, James Turrell. And what you're looking at here is Roden Crater as it existed in the early 80s. It's one of a series of craters out in the Painted Desert near Flagstaff, Arizona, that Turrell decided he was going to use as the basis for a huge earthwork, basically light installation. And this project, which began in 1984, is still incomplete. He's still working on it. But I tell you about this because when it finally does open up, get in the queue to go see it. It's likely to be something quite amazing. So it's out in the middle of nowhere. Right now it's closed. But what he decided to do, and some of you will be, I hope, familiar with James Turrell's work, and if you haven't yet, I'll show you this in a few moments. But of course, we have one of his sky viewing spaces at the Henry Art Gallery. James Turrell started as a light artist, and then he began to fashion light in a way by just creating apertures through which you see the sky. And one of his most famous apertures are these sky viewing spaces, different shapes through which you look up at the sky that do these incredible things to your perception of the sky based upon the lighting conditions. The original idea for Roden Crater, the big kind of project, was to open up the crater itself so that it would have straight sides, and when you would see through that aperture at the sky as the light conditions change, it does amazing things, as I said, to the sky. It will bring the sky right down to the top of this as if it is a flat painting. Sometimes, and this is the coolest thing that it does, at a particular moment near twilight, the sky will create what's known as a celestial vault. You'll be looking at it through this open aperture, and it will bend up away from you as if you're looking at, let's say, the domed vault of a church or what have you. In other words, what he's doing is he's drawing attention to a way that your perception of the world is influenced by all these little minute factors around you and he's creating an amazing kind of experience for you by doing simple things like that. Now, it kept getting more complex, so I'm just going to show you a schematic of, I think this is about 10 years ago now, so it might have even added a few things since then. But what he's gone on to do is, in addition to the sky viewing space looking up through the sides of the crater, he's created all of these different little viewing spaces, primarily with apertures that are pointed towards various celestial events. So, for instance, there will be a long cement tube that is perfectly lined up to when the moon once a year, hits that spot in the sky. And when it lines up to that aperture, it creates a pinhole camera. Just like maybe you created when you were looking at the eclipse a couple of years ago, right? Any little aperture pointed at a light source will project into a darkened interior, a kind of holographic image. So if you just create a tube pointed at the moon and then a big black box, basically, it will create a projection in that box that looks like a three-dimensional moon. And if you've got any kind of lens on it, it will turn that into a really three-dimensional high-def image. So he's playing with things like that. Some of these things happen like once a month. Others happen once, a year. And then he's got things like when Venus aligns with Jupiter and Mars is descending, or who the hell knows what's going on in these things. That only happen once every like 200 years or so. So why would you be doing that? Well, I think a big component of this idea behind his work is not just to situate you or make you think about how you're situated in this larger universe. I mean, just this immense universe, something that is beyond our comprehension, right? Billions of stars, billions of light years. It's just immense, but also in relation to historical time. If something only happens once every 300, 400 years, and yet this work has taken that into account, how does it make you think differently about time? And why are those types of considerations important? And I'll just give you for instance. This is just a simple little anecdote, and I don't remember any of the details about it, but it really struck me. There was something that was probably on NPR, and they were talking about one of the big English dining halls in one of the universities, and how it had these gorgeous giant beams that spanned this huge area that were finally, after 400 years, rotting out, and they had to find replacements for this. And they wanted to keep the aesthetic, right? Open wood beams across it. And they didn't know how to do this because there were no longer any giant oak trees that were big enough to span the space, or so they thought. And they actually searched all over to try to source these things and had very little luck. They went to the library, so the story goes, and were looking at some of the plans for the building just to double check something. And the librarian, who was curious about what they were doing, asked them, and when they told him that they were looking for trees or wood that was suitable to span this space, he said, you know what? Here's the thing. You know that grove of oak that are on the north end of the campus? They were specifically planted 400 years ago for exactly this purpose, so that when those rotted, these old oak now could be cut to refashion the timbers. Right? The way we think today is quite different than the way people thought in the past. A little bit of foresight, for instance, of planting a simple acorn right in the ground could produce a oak tree 400 years later that could solve this momentous problem. Now, the funny thing is that those oak trees, because they were so precious now, didn't ever get cut down. They left them up and went with a different solution. But it just makes you think, right? A little bit about, in our day and age of planned obsolescence and one thing rapidly replacing another, where everything seems very frenetic, how does kind of rethinking your, your place in historical time, something, that's gone on for billions of years, make you think about your place in the world and what's important and what isn't? In any case, he keeps playing around with these ideas, again, fairly metaphorically. This is, you can't get good views of this, but this is a picture that's supposed to give you a sense of what that celestial vaulting looks like if you look through the top of Broken Crater here are some of the sky viewing spaces, collection kind of domes that reflect light through these various apertures, such as over here. You can maybe see it if you follow my cursor, that will project imagery within this interior space where you sit. In any case, James Turrell actually started off with really, really simple projects on the 1960s. This is one of his works known as the Afram Proto series, where he would, in a very darkened room, project light that had been shaped by just taking a light projector and passing it through various little stenciled shapes that then when they hit a wall, or in this case a corner, would rectify themselves so that they looked like three-dimensional light. They're super simple on the one hand, and they're incredibly complex on the other, because what you can't tell in this image is that depending on where you're standing in this room, this image that right now looks like a light cube can keep changing its shape. You walk one way and it gets oblong. You walk another way, it goes flat. You tilt down a little bit, it changes orientation, and you look at it straight on, it looks like a 3D cube. Now, James Turrell, for his part, always talks about the way that he wanted the viewer to experience what he called a non-vicarious experience. Meaning he didn't want you to experience the world through his point of view, as he thought most artists of the past had wanted you to. Instead, what he wanted to do was set up a situation in which you could non-vicariously, in other words, through your own experience, really experience the world. Even more pointedly, though, James Turrell's big, I suppose you could call it an agenda or big hope for viewers, is that they would test what he calls the learned limits of perception, or what he sometimes calls prejudice perception. I think I brought up this before, but I'm going to say it again. Our experience of the world is always prejudiced. Prejudice means at root prejudgment, and it is the way that human beings very efficiently function in the world. Prejudice just means to prejudge something. So sometimes it's really bad, we know, prejudging a gender or a sexuality or an ethnicity based upon stereotypes that demean or belittle, that's no good, obviously. But prejudice is also the way that we judge whether something's hot or something's cold based upon our previous experience, whether something is dangerous or whether something is productive based upon our earlier experiences, right? It's something that we live with constantly. And so what someone like Turrell wants to do by setting up these situations in which you experience something, now you're looking at that same light box, but it's up at the corner of a room, corner of a ceiling and a wall, is to put you into a situation where you say something like, oh, I know exactly what that is, I finally figured it out, only to move one direction or move another direction and realize, wait a minute, you don't entirely know this thing inside and out. You have to test your prejudices. And I think that's a really good thing to be thinking about. It's something that is a huge part of avant-garde art that's about making you think about the world in new and innovative ways, right? Think about things from a new perspective that you maybe hadn't entertained before. And I say this during a time period where I feel like people are really locked in their own echo chambers, where most of us, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else, really think they know what's right and wrong, and the other side is completely off base and so forth. And if we continue to think that way, if we don't test and believe, of course, that our own perspectives on things are imperfect, as a species, we're certainly not going to get anywhere. This is a simple kind of analogic version of that, where you step into a space and you see something and you're like, oh, I know what that is. That's a this, only to find out later it's not that at all. It's something else entirely. So here's another, for instance, as his work progressed into the 1970s in these spaces that are called shallow space constructions. This one's called Amba specifically. These are little niches in the wall that are filled with light that depending on where you're standing in the space will look different colors, but it's not different lights. It's just one frequency of light that, again, because of shading in one place or because the angle that you're looking at it, will appear to be different colors. You also, depending on where you are in the room, might not be able to tell this is actually a shallow niche in a wall. It may very well look like someone has just projected light on the wall or frankly even painted the wall. And so you really have to go, and you can't trust your eyes, right? You can't trust this form of prejudice, this sense. Many times you have to go up and literally kind of stick your hand in there to confirm that it is what you suspected it to be, a shallow space. And this is where it even gets weirder. I swear to God, I've seen these things a million times, and when you see a warm color, half the time you're sure that if you stick your hand in there, it's going to feel warmer, even though you know that's ridiculous, that it's going to be the same as the blue that looks like it's going to feel cooler. And then these things just keep getting more complex and frankly cooler and cooler. This is a work that was shown at the Henry Art Museum in years ago in 2004 when they opened up Light Rain, the sky viewing space during that time. And basically what you're looking at is a giant room that is filled with a monofrequency of light. This monofrequency is, and he's tinkered around with this, it causes what's known as a Gansfield effect that causes partial optical blindness. Now, when he first did these, he did pure monofrequencies, and that Gansfield effect was so extreme for some of us who are quite sensitive that it creates vertigo and nausea, and you just, believe it or not, just a simple monofrequency trips up all of your equilibrium, and some people are like, we're crawling on the ground trying to get out of these spaces. So he simplified that a little bit and added a little bit less of that monofrequency and a couple of other frequencies so that it's not as severe. But what happens is you walk into these very lit spaces. In this case, it looks like a blue cloud. And when you get in there, very quickly, because your eye is being saturated with this monofrequency, it really stops seeing very well. And so you'll look at your hand right in front of your face, and you'll only see like right through the middle of your hand, and pretty soon you can't really tell where the walls are or other people in the space, how far away they are or exactly where they are. And he'll also mess around with you a little bit by slanting the floor up just slightly and the walls in just slightly. So pretty soon you're walking around this, even though you can see completely well, wondering where the walls are and where other people are and so forth. And while you're doing this, of course, people outside the room are watching you wander around in this very lit space, looking like you're walking around in the dark. And again, this is a way that he's thinking of you testing and really being aware of how much your sensory experiences influence your conceptualizations, the way you make sense of the world, right? And we all kind of know this, especially if you've ever, and God perish the thought, been intoxicated, and when you experience the world in altered states, it's not the same world. So what does that say when we rest on this idea of a normative experience? And frankly, that normative experience is based upon these really imperfect senses: sight, taste, smell, and so forth. And here, just very quickly, I want to point you in the direction of these sky viewing spaces. You're looking at a space that's, again, they started in the early 70s. He continues to produce these today to help fund his projects. It's just a big space in which the white that you're seeing in this image is the open aperture that points to the sky. Some of them have only ambient light in them, such as Light Rain, ours at the Henry Gallery, and others have other forms of illumination, man-made illumination, along with the ambient light outside. But this space, which I'm going to show you now at twilight, is changing color completely based upon the light that it is receiving from outside. Here's a for instance of what it does to the sky. As he points out, we tend to think of the sky as being up there. But the sky, or what we call the sky, is really the atmosphere around us every day. It's this matter that is around us that we take to be empty, that's not empty at all. And when you create these spaces, these sky viewing spaces, it really makes material something that we tend to think of as immaterial. So here's one view of it, here's another, right? And here's your light rain. And if you haven't been there, please go, when sanctions are lifted, so to speak. Now I'm going to point you out to some of the major icons of Earthworks, and I'm not going to take you through all the ins and outs, but I hope to provoke enough of you, provoke your interest enough that some of you at some point in your life will go try to seek these out. This is Nancy Holt's famous work called The Sun Tunnels from 1973 to got finished in 76. It's out near the Great Salt Lake in one of the salt flats. It's basically 4 giant cement tubes. They're about 12 feet tall and 25-ish feet long. They look a little bit like, abandoned culverts out in the middle of nowhere. But they're set up out in this spot that you have to, again, pilgrimage to find on axis to key celestial events. The rising of the summer solstice, the sun during the summer solstice, and the setting of the sun during the winter solstice. So in the summer, on summer solstice, the sun rises and directly aligns itself with one set of these apertures, and then in winter the other 2 apertures. You probably may kind of intuit that a lot of these works of art are pointing towards early prehistoric works of art that also were set up so as to be aligned with various celestial events, such as some components of the cromlechs that are all over Ireland, like Newgrange, or in England, such as Stonehenge, that has a couple components to it that do the same thing, in order to kind of hark back to earlier ages in which people were really much more aligned with natural events than they were with civilized events, and those types of events being important primarily to an agrarian, early kind of prehistoric culture, of course instantiated different values in those cultures. In this one, what is so remarkable about these is that when you're out here, and every time I've been there, it's been in the summer during my summer break, it's very, very hot. You're in the salt flats around the Great Salt Lake. You're up at about 6,500 feet. It's fairly arid, very little rainfall, and it's hot, and it's got its own kind of ambient noise because there are very long vistas of the light wind blowing through all this kind of sage grass and all this heat, and it's a blasting kind of light. And then when you step inside of these, everything changes dramatically, right? Step inside, the temperature goes down, the light changes from this glaring, kind of almost desert light to a diffuse light or even shadow. The sound even changes because, of course, it muffles and changes the sound and directs it in different ways. And by the way, every single one of these tubes has a slightly different sound. The other thing, though, that's going on here is if you look at these little circular light patterns, these are the light patterns caused by holes that are drilled in the tube in the shape of constellations. So that if you sit down in these and just for a while kind of rest, as the sun moves, so these constellations created by, again, projected light in the interior against the shadow move in the same way they would across the sky at night. There's one of Nancy Holt's work a little bit closer to you. I'm going to put in a few of these close to home. Earthworks, this is her rock ring stone enclosure up at Western Washington University that, like many of her works, is created out of the natural materials of the area. These are stones that she quarried from around this area. It's set up in a series of circles based upon the cromlech form that is found all over, in particular, Ireland, that's associated with cyclical views of nature, right? A culture that really had to pay attention to the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the sun, so as to be aware of, moments to plant and to harvest and so forth. All of the apertures, including the windows and the doors, are aligned north, south, east, and west. It's just a cool little sculpture. Right below this, in the grass, is another sculpture by Robert Morse, the guy who did the Untitled L-beams, that's known as the steam sculpture. And it's just a bed of rocks, and at various times of the day that I went to Western, by the way, as an undergrad, so I know this firsthand. You never know when this thing is going to go off. It will just emit steam, and that steam becomes its own sculpture, responding, again, unpredictably to the conditions of its context, how hot it is out, how humid it is out, how light it is out, where the wind is blowing during this time, and so forth. Another work by Robert Morse that's fairly close to us is the so-called Kent Gravel Pit, that is just a little bit south of South Center off Old Military Road. And in this case, what Robert Morse did is he took the site of an old hill mining for gravel that, they basically go into the side of a hill and they just take out all the gravel and they leave this, open maw of destruction behind them. And he refashioned it as an outdoor sculpture by terracing all of these areas. A terrace is, by the way, one of the earliest forms of erosion control that was practiced going back to historical times. So it's this little kind of nod for taking care of the environment. Although he's really, really adamant about not wanting to think of art as a way to solve the problems of a very capitalistic-oriented society that was interested in basically taking everything that it can from nature, regardless of the cost of that. In any case, this is what it looks like when you're up above it, looking out over the Kent Valley. It looks giant. It just looks like this huge, giant space down below you. But the curious thing is that when you walk down into it, which you're invited to do, it keeps changing and getting more intimate, so that when you're in the very bottom part of this, follow my cursor down in this spot, it looks tiny all of a sudden. And that's his way of, now in an outdoor sculpture, drawing our attention to that known constant versus the experienced variable. It's changing dimensions and scale depending on where you are relative to this sculpture. One of the most iconic land earthworks is this one, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is about an hour and a half away from the sun tunnels of Nancy Holt, whom he was married to at the time. Originally, when he conceived of this work, he created a jetty out of the basalt that is in this area of the Salt Lake to extend out a little over 100 meters into the lake and curl around on itself above the water level. Now, because the level of the Great Salt Lake fluctuates so frequently, sometimes I've seen this where it's completely submerged so that you have to walk out and kind of wade the Great Salt Lake. And other times I've seen it where it's landlocked. In other words, the lake doesn't even start until one time I saw it was almost a half a mile off of this, out in the middle of nowhere. It's very, very shallow, by the way, the Great Salt Lake. Now, what he had in mind when he created this was drawing again your attention to the beauty of nature, because the Great Salt Lake is so full of saline and minerals that depending on its depth and lighting conditions, it will continuously change color. And you can go hang out there and watch this occur over the course of a day, where if you get there in the morning, it looks purple. As the light comes off, up and shines across it at a raking angle, it can turn blood red, and then as it gets a little higher, a kind of pinkish color, and then finally resolve itself to blue. Or as you're looking at it here, by creating the different depths of the Salt Lake, you can see the pink along with the blue next to it and so forth. The other thing, though, that he was thinking about doing was that at the time he was really caught up with the idea of entropy, which is a kind of cosmological principle that I think most scientists agree with now, which is from the moment of the Big Bang to our moment, the universe is actually, of course, as far as we know, expanding And in its expansion, its energy is dissipating and its organization with it. And for Robert Smithson, this was a really curious idea to think about, that it's as if the universe is winding down, so to speak, and getting more and more disorganized relative to human society, which tends to conceive of itself as getting better and progressing and getting more organized and more efficient and building productivity and so forth. And he wanted you to be in a situation in which you thought of both of those things concurrently. And the spiral itself was supposed to be symbolic of that idea of entropy. The final thing I want to say before I leave this work is that if you've yet to be there, go there, you have got to go see the Great Salt Lake. It's the weirdest thing you've ever seen. The saline levels are absurd. I mean, when the Salt Lake goes down, it leaves behind crusts of salt that are, I mean, you can't even dig to the bottom of them. They're 12 inches thick of just crusty salt everywhere. It makes it look like as if it's snow to me. It's like snow everywhere, and you walk out on it and it crunches in these weird ways. And of course, salt is an incredible preservative, so every little creature that's ever wandered out into the Great Salt Lake and died is basically like, fossilized in the salt. So it's a very, very cool experience, and just like bizarre that you have this almost landlocked, very saline ocean in the middle of Utah. Here's how he constructed it. Really simple method. Just fill up a dump truck full of the basalt on the shoreline, back it out in a one-lane road and dump it out, and just continue to do that so that, a few years later, this is what it looks like. Sometimes, again, depending on the water level, the basalt is very, very black. If the water level comes over it, it takes away all the saline. If it's been out in the open for a while, it turns white like this. Another iconic work from the land earth art tradition is Walter de Maria's Lightning Field. Now, Walter de Maria does some pretty interesting things in his work. He's a bit all over the place. He died a few years ago now. He is best known, though, for situating you relative to what we have been calling the sublime, right? This order of magnitude of organization or of size that is creates in you these kind of conflicting feelings of feeling expansive and awe-inspired, but also feeling tiny and minuscule relative to this order or this magnitude of size. Or another way to put this is, remember when I was talking about the sublime and I said, Immanuel Kant said, it's these glimpses of the sublime that let you know there's some kind of organization out there that is even more complex than your mind can ever get to, but it's there and it's there, and that's your experience of the sublime. And I think that's kind of what he's going at here, although he seems to be wanting to do it in order to say to us, hey, humans, remember all of the ways that you try to make sense of the world are puny human attempts to make sense of something that is well beyond humans' comprehension. So in Lightning Field, what you're looking at from afar is this field of lightning rods that are approximately 20-ish feet tall or so. They're all exactly the same level at height, or supposed to be, as if you put a piece of glass over the top of this giant space, that glass would rest evenly on all the tops of these poles, even though the contours of the ground, of course, change a little bit. They are at the top of a high mesa on basically a kind of plateau in an area that gets lightning strikes very frequently over the course of about 3.5 to 4 months. But here's the thing that is so interesting about them. He set them up as a grid. And it's a perfect grid that runs 1 mile one way and 1 kilometer another way, with equal spacing between all of these. And if you think about this, it's his way of saying, here are two measuring systems, two ways that humans organize their understanding of the universe, a mile or a kilometer, and that kind of grid that is placed over nature, as if this is the lens or one of the lenses through which we experience the natural world, all these concepts that we bring to make sense of the natural world. Now, when you go to see this, you don't get to just show up, by the way. You have to make reservations and pay a nominal fee that is set up so as to pay for the land and keep this conserved. You have to spend all day there. And over the course of the day, what you primarily see are changes in light that reflect off of these posts that are all stainless steel. So every little flicker of the light or change of the shadow, and these things change. And, you know, I love John Cage, so one part of this is about that Cagean drawing your attention to the excellence of everyday life, or drawing your attention to the beauty of the world that surrounds you every day that might go unnoticed. And then, if you're into big experiences, of course, during 3.5, 4 months of the year, very frequently lightning storms come through this area and light up this lightning field. And while there's been no documented case, although God knows how they would ever document this anyway, of lightning striking the posts, it strikes in this area constantly. And every time it comes into this area and, you know, that lightning goes off, all of these poles over a mile long just light up with every lightning strike and flicker with every lightning strike. And it's just amazing, right? It's just one of those experiences that, again, if you can fit it into your bucket list, I suggest you try to do. His, again, penchant for drawing attention to the way that humans try to make sense or organize the world happens indoors as well. I just wanted to bring this one to your attention. It's a gallery space that is devoted to one work called the Broken Kilometer. These are stainless steel poles that, if you put them end to end, would all make up 1 kilometer. And just, again, think of how your mind conceptualizes this. Another famous collaborative team of artists who are associated with Earthworks or land art, although they're kind of in their own field, are Christo and Jean-Claude. And again, this was a collaborative husband and wife team. Jean-Claude died about 5 years ago, I think now, but Christo continues to work on. They were born, Christo's actually Bulgarian and Jean-Claude was French. So they were born outside of the United States, but I'm bringing in to this lecture on American artists because they live for the vast majority of their life in New York, and they produced a number of works in the United States, of course. What you're looking at here is their work that is called The Wrapped Coast, where in Australia they wrapped a coastline in this beautiful white polypropylene, completely non-invasive fabric in order to draw attention, again, to something that you might stop looking at, a coastline, by covering it up. And again, the simple way to explain this, it's a much more complex project, is that they oftentimes employ volunteers or local people to help make these projects. They collect money only from big collectors. They don't take any governmental grants or anything like that, and then they pour all their money into these projects. And many times there's at least an implicit little message about environmentalism that runs through a lot of their work. So for instance, with this one, where they cover up this coastline with this white kind of erosion control fabric, a protective fabric, think of all the times that you've seen a coastline that doesn't look like it's supposed to because it's completely covered with black sludge from oil, and how that then, how this work then makes you think about the human impact that we have upon the natural environment. And they do that over and again. So there's Christo. One of their famous works in the United States were these series of surrounded islands off of Biscayne Bay in Florida, where they just, with, again, this floatable pink fabric that was chosen because it's a little bit like the pink flamingos in the area, was used to wrap these islands. And by the way, this is how they sell these projects. They just sell little mock-ups or drawings to these rich collectors to generate the funds for these things. They don't sell anything after the fact. And then they created these islands. or these surrounding islands. Now, those islands themselves, and this is again the key kind of theme in their work, are not natural at all. They were actually created when the Army Corps of Engineers dredged this waterway. You can see all the boats running down the middle here in order to make this area productive for industry. And then they just dumped all of the extra dredging in the water off to the sides of this, creating these little, very precious microcultures. So this is, again, one of those ways that Christo and Jean-Claude might draw your attention to the way that humans have influenced nature or impacted nature and then forgot that they ever did it, and take these islands to be just little natural occurring things. One of my favorites of this, again, complex work of art that I'm just giving you an idea about, is this work that was called Running Fence. And if you're wondering, these works just go up for about 2, maximum 3 weeks. They're completely ephemeral, and then they come down. So they're not about selling works. They're not about the art as commodity. They're not even about something like the Earthworks where you can go and see it over and again. They're ephemeral. They're a call to come see it, and it's up for a while, and then it's down, even if many of them take up to a decade or more. Some of these, like Running Fence, took 15 years. The Gates project was over 25 years to even get, produced. Running Fence was, as the title suggests, a fence that was constructed out of fabric and little poles that spanned over 26 miles through Marin and Sonoma counties in California, crossing over 400 different properties. Part of it was about drawing attention to the beauty of these rolling hills and drawing attention to the fluctuations of light and of wind that would push these fences that were all created out of fabric one way and then the other way. Another part of this, though, was about a huge collaborative project that brought in engineers and all of the people who owned these many different properties, along with the government itself that had to conduct series of land impact studies for this project. And so, it's a kind of complex enterprise that is meant to set you up to have this experience or draw your attention to an experience that you could have without this by, again, creating, in this case, a fence that shows you the contours of the land and the fluctuations of light and wind. It even went all the way across Highway 101 down into the water to disappear under the water, as if this running fence went all the way, through the Pacific. Again, just a couple of quick ones here. This is their wrapped Pont Neuf in Paris. Some of you know the Pont Neuf is a bridge that spans both banks of the left and the right bank with the Ile de la Cité, which is where kind of most famously Notre Dame Cathedral is. It is the oldest bridge in Paris, and they wrap this up. It creates this kind of beautiful thing that I'm sure Parisians had seen a million times, and then you wrap it up and suddenly it garners more attention. Kind of like if you've ever seen kids around presents, you wrap them up and they really want to know more about whatever it is that's inside. But again, the other thing is they are at least implicitly political. The Pont Neuf is a building associated with what the French call the Ancien Regime, the kind of old aristocracy and royalty of France, which was originally sited on the Ile de la Cité. And if you listen to them talk enough, you'll get little glimpses that probably what they were trying to draw attention to is how old ideas about, in particular, prejudice, about certain segments of society being more important than others are still a huge part of French culture. In the United States, maybe the most famous project we're aware of Christo and Jean-Claude, is the Gates Project. The Gates Project was a series of gates, over 1,200 of these, spanning different parts of Central Park in Manhattan. They tried to get this project done over 20 years before the time that they actually got it okayed. Michael Bloomberg eventually gave it the okay, along with a number of other people who had to weigh in the government. in order to bring people back to Manhattan following 9/11, 2001. And that's really what got it going. But when they conceived of this project, again, it's just these simple gates all over Central Park. What they probably had in mind is during the 1970s, Central Park's status as, this park that was overrun, that wasn't well kept, that had vagrants and drug users and criminals in it. And if you ever watch a movie from the 1970s or 80s, the stereotype is always the same. If you go into Central Park, you're going to get murdered, basically. And they thought, well, this is, at least at one level of their intention, a way to open up the park to visitors again and make it more welcoming and bring people back to the park. When it was associated with 9/11, the same idea, bring people back to Manhattan as a sign of celebration. Over 6 million people visited this during the less than 3 weeks that it was up. But what they also had in mind here was once again drawing your attention to the way that humans impact their natural environment and then kind of forget the impact that we've had on our natural environment. Central Park, if you haven't been, is in the heart of Manhattan, which is one of the biggest cities in the world. Just giant skyscrapers everywhere, right? Big cosmopolitan center. Couldn't find anything that was more man-made. And then you see Central Park, and it just seems like someone just left one part of Manhattan completely natural and didn't touch it at all. But that's not at all the case. What happened was that the area that is currently Central Park was less suitable for construction. And so originally, before they ran out of, let's say, land here, they left it, and they even pushed like lots of the fill dirt that they excavated in order to build Manhattan into this area, and then hired a couple of very famous 19th century landscape architects to turn it into a park that was designed in order to mimic the experience that you would have in many of the English gardens, where you walk over rolling hills and see a little lake or pond down below that's framed by rocks over here, or as you see here, walk through a tunnel that frames your experience of nature in a particular way. Almost all of the trees were planted in Central Park at this time. So in other words, this thing that we take to be a natural phenomenon is actually a very carefully curated experience of nature, and we've just forgotten that that's the case. In fact, there's a component to this work, the color of the gates, the fact that they called them gates themselves. And by the way, all of these things were recycled so as to have minimal impact on the environment, that is related to a famous shrine in Kyoto, Japan, the Fushimi Inari shrine that you're looking at here. Inari is a kind of god-goddess, an androgynous god-goddess of rice and agriculture in the Shinto tradition, who is given these kind of prayer offerings, these gates with various, they're basically prayers on them, in order, from the business community, in order to placate this god. The god's basically associated with fertility and fecundity. And in Japanese culture, the idea of industry and something that is like the earth go hand in hand here. By the way, these gates run up to the Shinto shrine over miles, right? There, each new gate is given as an offering over many, many years of time. Now, the reason that this might be an illusion, be alluded to by the Gates Project, would be that Kyoto, of course, is it's a big term in terms of environmentalism. The first major multinational form of agreement on environmental protection was called the Kyoto Protocol, which of course the United States was the only first world nation not to sign on to, because we feared that it would constrict our business practices, which we continually do. And they may have been wanting to draw your attention to that, at least implicitly. One final work here, the Wrapped Reichstag building in Germany. Very, very complex project. Took over 20 years to come to fruition. The Reichstag was originally built to symbolize German unification. Germany didn't come together until 1870 as one unified nation. Before that, it was like Prussia and Bavaria and so forth, these different little kind of principalities. And this building that then housed the government was built to symbolize this. It's got a long and very tricky history. During the time of National Socialism, it was burned, probably at the hand of the Nazis, who then blamed it on the Communist Party in order to expel the communists from power and thus consolidate their own power. And it's a symbol of unification, of course. And so when this project finally got okayed was right after East and West Germany came back together as a unified nation. And people gathered, flocked to this, again, giant building being wrapped in order to talk about a lot of that hidden history, the history that no one wanted to talk about, of why Germany ever participated in National Socialism and the Holocaust. Again, up for a little bit less than 3 weeks, gathered together around 6 million people to visit this. So then let's just wrap up this quarter with some things that are in your neck of the woods that are kind of like land earth art. If you haven't seen it yet, this is the Fremont Troll underneath the north span of 99, right where it crosses the cut, and go check it out. It's a cement troll underneath the bridge, holding in its hand a real Volkswagen Bug that originally wasn't filled with concrete, but it had actual glass, but it kept getting vandalized, so they did it this way. As I say to people, because vagrants oftentimes hang out around this, and homeless people, looking for a place to stay, oftentimes use this protective cover of the bridge, oftentimes also use it as a bathroom. The troll actually not only looks like a troll, it smells like a troll. Or in Gasworks Park, you've ever gone up to the top of that hill and gotten that great vista onto Lake Union. At the top of it, of course, is Charles Greening and Kim Lazar's Sundial. The hill itself was built to house this sundial that's activated by you standing, depending upon the calendar, at different spots in order to function as a cosmological clock. Or a little bit closer to you, just on the, the north kind of east side of Magnuson Park in Noah's property, is Doug Hollis's A Sound Garden, which, by the way, is a work of art that gave Soundgarden, with Chris Cornell, its name. So here is a work of art that is activated by the wind. It's basically kind of like big, huge weather vanes, but the wind blows across these open tubes and creates its own sounds. Here's the walkway up to it, and the benches, and here are these stainless steel weather vanes that, again, fluctuate with the changes in weather, with the wind, and create their own sound. Finally, Robert Irwin's 9 Spaces, 9 Trees. This sculpture, which is basically a colored cyclone fence in which you have this play of organic elements of trees, and on the outside kind of the built environment, originally was behind the county courthouse and King County Jail downtown. It was, again, not intended in this way, and it's one of the reasons that Robert Irwin was fine when it finally moved. But a lot of people took this to be some type of commentary on the overcrowding of the jail downtown, because these trees, of course, perpetually grow and kind of burst out of this cyclone fence. It got moved, of course, to the University of Washington campus, where it is today below Odegaard. You may have seen it a million times and not realized that this weird little structure of fences enclosing trees is actually a fairly famous land earth artwork. Well, thank you for a fun quarter. I hope this has been enjoyable, and I certainly hope some of you take the opportunity sometime in your life to pilgrimage to one of these earthworks to see it. Take care.